Societal Flourishing, a Nietzschean Worldview, or St. Benedict's Abbey. Benedict of Nursia's rule and Friedrich Nietzsche's On the Genealogy of Morals offer two different ways of thinking about whether the contribution of religious asceticism affects the actions that lead to the flourishing of society. Both Nietzsche and St. Benedict speak about practices of asceticism and whether such practices can contribute to an improvement of human society. They come from different time periods and backgrounds and argue from different starting principles. St. Benedict charges his followers to act with strict adherence to ascetic values, specifically insisting on humility as the basis for a lifestyle. In contrast, Nietzsche's philosophy understands issues in the origins of asceticism and in the way Christianity's resentment embodies slave morality. These two thinkers, one an influential philosopher, the other a spiritual guru, present arguments that address the question of what is most beneficial for the flourishing of human society. St. Benedict comes from a place rooted in Christian scripture and tradition. This is his starting principle on which he builds the rule. Following the teachings of Jesus Christ and his church, Benedict proceeds to formulate a way of life that cultivates religious asceticism in order to create a mini society that exists on its own and by its own regulations. His morality is rooted in Christian teaching and emphasizes humility, obedience, love, and simplicity. According to Carroll and White, translator of the rule, Benedict grew up in a family of material means, yet chose the austere life of solitude and dedication to God within the communal monastic life, as stated in the introduction. In writing the rule, his intention was to create a school for the Lord's service in which those who have listened to God's call to follow him and to seek his heavenly kingdom will strive to make progress by means of a combination of good works, faith and God's grace, with the Gospels as their guide. White writes, under the influence of his rule, monastic existence came to play an integral, even dominant part in the European society of the Middle Ages and the formation of its culture. This work provided the foundation for monasteries, that is, the rule, throughout Europe, which in turn has kept scholarship thriving for centuries. Ironically, it is only through the contributions of the monastic tradition that Friedrich Nietzsche ever had access to the education of his time. Nietzsche, on the other hand, believes that society began by following a master morality, the morality of the strong-willed, which focuses on power and pride. Things like strength, power, and wealth contribute to the flourishing of the individual, because then through them one can strive to excel over others. The goal that Nietzsche advocates for is to win. Nietzsche explains what he calls the slave revolt in morality, the time when the resentment of the power of one class over another led to the lower class creating its own values. Because the ideas of morality were changed for the sake of certain individuals feeling oppressed, Nietzsche claims it came from a place of resentment. Accordingly, this was by those not in power at the time, but by those who were oppressed. More specifically, Nietzsche understands the origins here to lie in the priestly people, or the Jews, saying, who in opposing their enemies and conquerors were ultimately satisfied with nothing less than a radical revaluation of their enemies' values, for this alone was appropriate to a priestly vengefulness. It was the Jews who, with awe-inspiring consistency, dared to invert the aristocratic value equation. Nietzsche presents the new morality of the priestly caste as opposed to the master morality of those first in power. According to Nietzsche, this has a significant effect on the philosophy of asceticism because it comes from a morality that is false. Overall, it is important to see the differences in the starting principles of these men in order to put their ideas in dialogue with one another. Unsurprisingly, St. Benedict of Nursia offers an argument toward austere adherence to religious asceticism in the life of the monastery in his rule. He is focused on things beyond this world. Following the teachings of Jesus Christ, St. Benedict requires his monks to carry out God's commandments in what you do every day. Embrace chastity, hate no one. Do not be jealous or give in to feelings of envy. Do not take pleasure in disputes. Avoid pride, respect your elders, and care for those younger than yourself. in order to provide more fully structure to both the society of the monastery and the society surrounding it. This is his motivation. The very way of life he proposes and follows in his work is the argument itself. To avoid a sense of pride in these ascetic actions, St. Benedict made the pillar of humility the highest priority. His longest and most in depth chapter follows a 12-step method of humility that allows one to reach the perfect love of God, which casts out all fear. Everyone can and must actively pursue humility, according to St. Benedict. He makes a connection between the practice of religious asceticism and virtuous acts for the sake of others. St. Benedict believes that adhering to this strict ascetic lifestyle is necessary for the survival of the monastic community as a mini society, while also contributing to the flourishing of the society of the surrounding area. Again, focusing on scripture, he requires radical actions in relationships with others. When questioning private ownership and the distribution of goods, he writes, "As scripture says, let everything be held in common, so that no one should dare to claim private ownership of any possession." Specifically relating to those who live outside of the monastic community, St. Benedict writes, "Naturally show compassion towards old people and children. The authority of this rule should also provide for them." Concerning the reception of guests, he writes, "All guests who arrive should be received as if they were Christ, for he will say, 'I was a stranger, and you took me in.'" Because monks learned to follow a strict religious asceticism, the structure of the monastery was benefited and it contributed to the flourishing of itself and the surrounding area. St. Benedict insists that his monks grow in relationship with God through strict adherence to ascetic practices while growing in communion with brothers of the community and wider society as a whole by taking up this role. His firm organization of such a mini society by embracing asceticism is what allows this to happen. Friedrich Nietzsche proposes that Christian morality comes from the resentment of the priestly caste and argues that anything from such a starting place limits one's ability to flourish, specifically when relating to such lowly things like religious asceticism. The argument in his third essay, "What is the Meaning of Ascetic Ideals?" has two important parts: that the ascetic ideal is unnecessary because it is a fabrication to fulfill an empty place in humanity, and that Christian morality of asceticism cannot contribute to the flourishing of an individual or society because it is merely a consequence of the resentment felt by the lower class. Nietzsche suggests that asceticism is humanity's attempt to answer the question, "Why do I suffer?" saying, "The meaninglessness of suffering, not suffering itself, was the curse that lay over mankind so far, and the ascetic ideal offered man meaning. It was the only meaning offered so far. Any meaning is better than none at all." Nietzsche's second point of the third essay is that resentment in action was allowed by slave morality. Contrary to master morality, the so-called priestly caste attached things like poverty, humility, chastity to the good, to virtue. Instead, Nietzsche thinks people should follow a lifestyle that is active, strong, spontaneous, and aggressive. He is sure to make it clear that just because many have followed an ascetic ideal does not mean that they attained virtue. Rather, this archaic model is seen by Nietzsche as a false solution in slave morality. Rather than allowing for flourishing, he thinks that asceticism does the opposite and restricts the flourishing of the individual. Accordingly, there is no direct correlation between following ascetic practices and contributing to individual or societal flourishing. Regardless of the fact that monasteries objectively allowed for some extent of flourishing of human society, as explained by White, Nietzsche argues that it is not the ascetic aspect that allowed the tradition of St. Benedict's rule to flourish. Instead, Nietzsche believes flourishing, especially for the individual, can only be achieved through a freedom of individual desire. In a sense, he argues that society should return to master morality. One might say that the master morality of Nietzsche that he desires can work only for the few elite. For if the top is to be the top, there must also be a bottom. This may work as a morality for some individuals, but it may struggle if used as a moral norm for a whole society. Both Nietzsche and St. Benedict have insights and opinions in determining what is most necessary for human society to thrive. Nietzsche is of the opinion that the origin of the so-called ascetic ideal arose from two problems. that humans found the wrong answer to an issue within the human condition, attributing meaning to something that has no meaning, and that it was resentment that caused the slave morality of which Christianity took hold. Contrastingly, St. Benedict embraces the religious asceticism of the Christian monastic tradition as a starting principle on which to focus an argument. From the beginning, these men based their ideas and beliefs on different starting principles. This is important to understand when comparing their arguments to see that the origins of their thoughts come from contrary perspectives. Nietzsche sees the pointlessness of following an ascetic ideal and reasons that Christian morality that encourages such a lifestyle is only the effect of the resentment of slave morality. Regardless of the fact that monastery lifestyles provided for the flourishing of society, such as influencing education for the better, Nietzsche refuses to find resonance between that fact and ascetic practices. St. Benedict challenges Nietzsche in his thinking by insisting that it is the ascetic aspect of his rule that allows for his monks to flourish as individuals, the monastery to succeed as a community, and surrounding culture and society to thrive. In fact, the cause of such focus on self-discipline aims at establishing a flourishing, functioning mini-society of the monastery. As mentioned before, this is oriented by the principles of Christian teaching, contributing toward the needs of all in relationship with one another, rather than a race toward power or wealth for an elite individual. Nietzsche suggests we reevaluate the original human condition and rethink a solution to the problem of meaninglessness, while St. Benedict embraces the place of humanity and seeks to organize it into a functioning society of people by following ascetic rules. Two arguments are presented between these two works. They're certainly not in agreement. To put it simply, Nietzsche and St. Benedict have different fundamental principles in which they build their arguments, consciously or not. It is necessary to consider Nietzsche's points and discuss thoroughly his error in thinking, yet understanding his opposing side. If Nietzsche's process of resentment was correct and the flourishing of monasticism was unrelated to religious asceticism, perhaps St. Benedict would fall short. The Nietzschean rejection of Judeo-Christian slave morality works, but presumably only for the top few elite. Instead, the rule shows that the way of life is an argument in itself, and context explains its role in providing for human society to thrive. For the first time, both religious asceticism and communal living are integrated into a single rule which allows for flourishing in both the monastic society and the surrounding community. However, some people claim that spoken truth is directly correlated to impressiveness of facial hair. So, perhaps a better question: Fred's mustache or Ben's beard? What do you think?